please welcome the Prime Minister of Canada. I know that one of your signature policies since you've been Prime Minister has been to increase investment in infrastructure, and that's an important and interesting thing that I'd like to discuss with you. But the theme of this session is disrupting the status quo in Canada. And so what I'd like to ask you first is, what things do you think need disruption in Canada? What aspects of the way the economy is set up and regulated do you think need to be disrupted in order for Canada to advance at the pace that it ought to advance? And I'm thinking of interprovincial trade barriers, ownership restrictions in telecoms, airlines, things like that, supply management. Which of those things do you think need to go?
I think I'd first of all go a little bit higher level than all of those. I mean, you sort of glossed over the fact that investment is one way of doing it. We, for a number of years, were stuck in a sort of a lower growth than we needed model that was giving tax breaks to the wealthiest Canadians, and we weren't getting the kinds of outcomes for middle-class Canadians that were needed. So we made a big bet in this past election that we were going to invest instead of look for cuts and savings, and that has really shaken up sort of Canada's fiscal approach to challenges, and we're getting great support from the IMF, from the OECD, from a lot of people who are looking at Canada as being an example of how we need to tackle the persistent challenge of low global growth. But beyond that, when we look at more specific things that we can do, the first thing I'll say is I've talked broadly about how I have a feminist approach to government, and I am a feminist. Getting women into the workforce and getting them to a level of equal pay, equal opportunities, equal respect is still very disruptive. When I look at this room, there's a lot of women, but it's still not at 50%. And we need to make sure that in our corporate governance, that in our decision-making bodies at all levels of government, we are creating opportunities for women to be incredibly successful, because the way the conversation changes when you approach that 50-50 gender balance has been demonstrated to be significantly better in terms of the outcomes that we get. And yes, women need to continue to fight for it, but men need to be allies in making sure that pay equity, that proper representation around the corporate tables are essential. Another area of disruption that we talk about a lot in Canada is diversity. Looking at differences, looking at new ideas coming in, new perspectives from around the world as a tremendous source of strength for our boards, for our companies, for individual success within pluralistic communities. That understanding that thinking around the problem by coming at it from very different directions is going to be a core part of how we innovate our way forward through the challenges we're facing. And finally, another big piece of the disruption is people have looked at me as being a bit of an outlier perhaps on a number of big issues, whether it's protectionism or a narrow view of protectionist nationalism or a range of issues on the world stage. I sort of see myself as just being one of the early representatives of a new generation of leaders that are coming up that are my age and younger, who look at the world very differently than previous generations did, and adapting to a world in which gender identity, feminism, diversity, embracing globalization is just natural and comfortable, and the way we need to build is going to challenge a lot of the structures we have around here.
Well, the panel I was chairing before we met, one of the panelists got a little round of applause when he said he was talking about how in some provinces the truck lights have to be a certain width, and in other provinces they have to be a different width, and this is a kind of a barrier to trade within Canada. And people I talk to cite a lot of things like that. And so I'm sort of, are there not any steps towards liberalization and deregulation that you also think ought to be part of the package that you're trying to deliver?
Absolutely, but the way to get that done is not for the federal government to sit there and impose. The way to do that is to actually have a good working relationship with the provincial premiers, with municipal governments, with Indigenous leadership, because Indigenous governments are the fourth level of government in this country, and making sure that we are actually properly coordinating, collaborating for the benefit of our collective citizens is essential. So there are very exciting conversations going on at the Council of Federation table this summer. We're going to have First Ministers meetings that will address a broad range of issues, from interprovincial trade barriers to smart regulations. I think one of the things that Canada does well is regulations. We're one of the countries that has been shown around the world to be where ease of doing business is always in the top ranked. We understand the need for regulation. The government has a role around regulations, but it has to be in service of both enhancing business and protecting the consumer and citizens. And getting that balance right is easier when you have a frame where people are getting along and want to use it not as a way to create advantages or close off access to a provincial market from their neighbors, but to realize that we can actually be more competitive within ourselves and on the world. The conversations I've had with leading auto manufacturers who are looking to Canada as a place where testing autonomous cars and looking at the way we can respond to their need to innovate and think about how to practically implement the kinds of solutions that we're going to be looking at in the coming decades. This is what Canada can do very well, and that's certainly something we're going to be working on.
Let's talk a little bit about infrastructure and investment. I think a lot of people have applauded that your government has sort of pioneered the notion of actually spending money to improve infrastructure, especially at a time when the economy is weak and debt is low. But I think there's a lot of skepticism about how well this money is going to be spent. And I'd be interested to know how you're going to make sure that it's spent well to, not only to put money into the economy, but to really increase the potential growth of the economy.
Well, there's actually two aspects to that. First of all, there is skepticism because often when the federal government decides to spend money on infrastructure, it can't but help itself to say, okay, well, let's make sure that the subway line goes through ridings that we either hold or want to hold. Make sure there's political advantages. We're not going to invest anything in that part of the country because no matter what we do, they'll never vote for us. These kinds of questions tend to creep into big infrastructure spends. I mean, there was a lot of analyses over which districts got more out of the stimulus spending following the 2008 recession. So one of the things that we said is we're going to trust local experts, municipal leadership, provincial leadership in many ways, to determine what projects are needed for this community or that community. What's going to contribute to long-term growth? What's going to respond to the needs that people have and not have the federal government putting conditions that are ultimately political. The conditions we will put on, though, is that these investments have to contribute to long-term growth, the way obviously public transit in the right kinds of places will significantly increase productivity and quality of life for citizens. But also, we're looking for incrementality. We're looking to ensure that the new money we're putting into infrastructure is not going to be money that was going to be spent anyway, that is going to be innovative, that is going to be on top of predictable or planned or already in the process of being built projects, because we have to be putting new money into the system in order to get that growth boost that we simply haven't been on track to get. And a big piece of that is also going to be understanding the leveraging capacity that we have. If we're going to be putting money in, we should be looking at leveraging either private investments or trying to make it an attractive pitch for pension funds to decide to invest in. There is a lot of opportunity opportunity for global capital that is beginning to understand that the high returns promised from the developing world investments come with levels of risk that need to be mitigated by investing in places where there is tremendous economic, fiscal, political, social stability, and a very strong workforce base, from high quality manufacturing to top-notch executives and management. These kinds of things are the pitch that we're busy making that we know are pushing us in the right direction.
Let me move on to climate policy, which I know is a big priority for you. Isn't Canada going to need a much higher carbon price or equivalent to achieve the emissions reductions that it's promised? And how are you going to achieve that higher carbon price?
We know that for 10 years we haven't been doing our fair share on the environment. The previous government was under the mistaken impression that the way to get energy projects built and to grow the economy was to push aside environmental concerns and minimize concerns that citizens or communities had around various growth strategies. And what that demonstrated was that's a good way to not get things done. That's a good way to freeze development, because people will simply remove the social license, the public trust that is now necessary. We saw it that even our closest friends and trading partners in the United States were unwilling or unable to believe that we were living up to our responsibilities on doing development responsibly, and therefore said no to Keystone XL, for example. What we've demonstrated is that we know that smart regulations, that putting a price on carbon, that ensuring that we are being responsible, has already significantly eased the task of coordinating with the United States on environment and energy strategies. As to exactly how we're going to move forward on carbon pricing, well, one of the great things about Canada, which is also one of the challenges about Canada, is we have very different challenges and strengths and responsibilities and opportunities from coast to coast to coast. So making sure that we're working hand in hand with provincial governments on the models that work for them. I mean, BC has one of the most successful carbon taxes in the entire world that is working very well, and it works well for their economy in a way that it might not work for Ontario's economy or for Nova Scotia's economy.
Right, but we heard a comment earlier today that BC's carbon price would have to quadruple if Canada is to meet those targets. And I think Canada is also considering even making those targets more ambitious. So
we are, first of all, we need to make sure that we get prices on carbon right across the country. And that's the first step. We sat down, all the first ministers just a couple of months ago, and got broad agreement that the way forward included carbon pricing. The mechanisms whereby different jurisdictions will embark upon that, we're leaving a certain amount of flexibility to, but there is no question that, as you say, we are going to have to achieve significant reductions, and we're going to be looking for the effectiveness of various approaches to pricing carbon, along with other issues. I mean, Ontario significantly reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by phasing out coal plants. That didn't have any, that didn't require a carbon price to do. It was a regulatory decision that made significant steps in that way. We have to look at a bundle of approaches to do it, of which carbon pricing is going to be one important but not the only tool in our toolbox.
A report came out recently from Policy Horizons, which I think is a sort of kind of a government-linked think tank, which said that falling prices for renewables are going to make it sort of big investments in oil infrastructure, pipelines in particular, uneconomic. So I'm wondering, do you think that, there's a lot of talk about pipelines in Canada, do you think Canada's actually going to need those pipelines?
We are not a day or a week or a year or even a decade away from a world that doesn't need oil anymore. We definitely have to get off oil. We need to be part of figuring out how we do that. But in the short term, we're still going to rely on fossil fuels as a global economy. And the question is going to be who can extract those fossil fuels and transform them in the most efficient, best possible way that both protects the environment or minimizes the impact on the environment as we move forward, but uses this time going forward to make sure that we're leaping as quickly forward into renewables as we possibly can. That's the responsible path we need to be on, and that's very much where all provincial premiers agree with me on. How we get there is going to be the negotiations and the challenges that have always animated Canada.
Okay.
But I'm very optimistic because we're in agreement. Listen, Canadians understand we need to build a strong economy. We need to make sure that our environment is protected. There's no longer a choice to be made between the two. You can't pretend you're doing something that's good for the economy but bad for the environment and actually have it be good for the economy unless you frame it in such narrow parameters and short-term timelines as to be basically useless.
And pipelines can be good for the environment.
Well, pipelines are significantly better than rail cars for transporting oil, for example. But that's an argument that in order to make it, we have to restore Canadians' trust in a government's ability to get things right for the long term and to balance the concerns that people have about jobs and their kids' jobs with the concerns they have about the world around them and the world their kids are going to grow up in. And where we saw a gap over the past years was that people no longer had confidence that the government was looking out for their best interests. The government was trying to be a cheerleader for the oil industry rather than being the responsible referee that actually would hopefully be able to get things done. Because one of the fundamental responsibilities of any Canadian Prime Minister, and this you can go back 100 years or you can go forward 100 years, is to get our natural resources to market. It's just that in the 21st century, you can't just throw down a railroad wherever you want it. 21st century means getting that public trust, respecting science, working with Indigenous partners. That balance is the new reality that Canadians understand we're functioning in, but we're going to be able to succeed within.
I have to ask you a question about Donald Trump.
You can ask a question. It doesn't mean I have to answer.
Right. I thought very carefully about what I want to ask because I think if I know you will work with whoever is elected president of the United States. But if that person is Donald Trump, what do you think it's important, especially important for him to know about Canada, about Canada's relationship with the US? What messages will you want to send to him apart from congratulations if he wins the election?
I think I'd start by reinforcing that the relationship between our two countries is far bigger than the relationship between any two of its leaders. The level of integration of supply chains, the back and forth travel of goods and people, the way that we have prospered side by side so significantly over the past centuries is something that will continue regardless of how aligned President and Prime Minister happen to be. But at the same time, our citizens, individually and collectively, expect their leaders to be creating opportunities for them to succeed and keeping them safe, and that the Canadian Prime Minister and the American President, whoever he or she may be, will be aligned in that goal.
And is there anything you'd want to warn him about not to do?
I don't know, something about rooting for an American team during the hockey playoffs, maybe. Although that's not as germane for this past season.
Well, let me talk to you about another important partner. Gosh, I'm not going to get through all I want to, but China. China seems to have issued something of almost an ultimatum to Canada. It seems to be saying, the ambassador seemed to say in a recent article, I think it was, look, we're very, very happy. We're very eager to deal with you, but, please don't talk too loudly about human rights. That's kind of the price of dealing with us. How do you respond to that ultimatum?
Canada has had a long and constructive relationship with China that goes back decades and generations. And throughout it, we have always both looked at economic opportunities and been very clear about human rights. There is no question that China has an awful lot of work to do on human rights, and quite frankly, if Canada, as a country that wants to see China do well and succeed on the world stage where it's taking up so much more place now, Canada has a very clear role to play as a country with a long and storied friendship with China, to be able to say, look, you need to change the way you speak to journalists. You need to change the defensiveness you have about how you're engaging with the world, because it's not doing you any service. You're now creating concerns around the world amongst people who would perhaps be positively inclined towards the opportunities that China represents for economic growth. I mean, adding hundreds of millions of people to the global middle class is a significant achievement. But handling that is going to require a little more it's going to require a slightly different approach than I think they can handle that. And it's going to take countries with a good relationship with China to be fairly blunt with China about how it's going to succeed in a world that is filled with both nuance and expectations by citizens that are significantly higher than they've been in the past.
We have a question that's arrived via app. I'll read it out. It says, in the 1950s, Canada pioneered multilateralism. How can Canada make its mark on the world today?
That's a great question, because I was accused fairly often during the election campaign of being nostalgic for the grand old days of Canadian peacekeepers or Canadian foreign diplomats and multilateralism. There is no nostalgia in my approach to the international stage. There is a very, very concrete understanding that the solutions that Canada has to offer and the way Canada has always at its best gone about offering them fits with what the world needs right now. First of all, our success around diversity. Being able to be a pluralistic, diverse society that does see differences as a source of strength instead of a source of weakness. When you look at the sectarian challenges, the conflicts between communities and nationalities around the world, you see that creating pluralistic societies, because that's the way globalization is going, with more and more migrants and refugees fleeing from either climate challenges or violent conflicts, we're going to have to learn to get along with people who are different from us. And there are very few places in the world that do that as well as Canada. And our approach to multilateralism, because we're of modest scale when it comes to economic might or cultural weight or military strength, has always been to be helpful, to seek consensus, to work with each other, to help people adapt some of the lessons we've had and roll up our sleeves and work alongside them to develop better systems or better approaches. That's something that the world needs, and quite frankly, Canada needs to see the world move along in meaningful ways. And that's where re-engaging in a thoughtful, robust way around the world is very much not just in keeping with the tradition of Canada, but very much what we can do in the modern context that is so much more important now that we have greater and greater incidences of non-state actors and failed states leading way to instability that is looking for ways out.
Let me take another question from the app. Labor supply has come up a few times today. How can Canada better compete in the talent wars?
One of the things that I was fascinated with is looking at all-in labor costs in the auto industry, for example. Are all-in labor costs in Canada and here in southwestern Ontario in the auto industry are significantly lower than the southern United States, which seems to be a place where we tend to be worried we're losing a lot of jobs to. What we have to understand is, Canada will be able to be incredibly competitive as a place to invest around the world as we showcase the quality of the goods and services we can produce, as we showcase the caliber of our education system, of our training, the stability of our economy, of our social structures, or our politics. The capital around the world is looking for places where there is long-term stability and returns. And Canada is one of those places that we haven't been selling nearly enough on the world stage, which is why, from the very beginning, whether it was at Davos or even on the margins of the Paris conference and the G20, I've been encouraging, exhorting people to look to Canada as a place where investments in manufacturing, in services and innovation makes an awful lot of sense. And that's something that I know we're going to be able to remain extraordinarily competitive in the world, on the world stage. I mean, people are now looking for places where they can both have a port into North American markets, but also leverage out from North America around the world, and the natural connections that Canada has with the world through its diaspora communities, its outlook on international trade, its openness to diversity, and the quality and caliber of our labor pool means that I'm very, very excited about the coming years of investment in Canada.
I think one of the things that the questioner was maybe trying to get at is I think the workforce is kind of aging and shrinking, and I'd be curious to know whether Canada can ramp up immigration enough to offset that.
I know we can. We demonstrated in what was more than just a symbolic exercise of bringing in 25,000 Syrian refugees in very short order, that we not only can ramp up our capacities to bring in more people, but we can all work together. I mean, the number of communities, of individual Canadians who stepped up in an extraordinarily welcoming way. I mean, John McCallum, our immigration minister, likes to point out that he's one of the only immigration ministers in the world who is facing the challenge of people clamoring at him to please let in more immigrants more quickly, because we need them to grow our communities, grow our businesses, grow our economy. That is a tremendous strength that Canada has. We need to do it right. We need to make sure we're building the support systems for these new arrivals who are going to be able to contribute, at the same time as we continue to encourage the Canadian population to grow, and how we empower our young people, and how we specifically reach out to Indigenous Canadians. The highest proportion of young people in this country are living in Indigenous communities, and we are simply allowing entire generations of young people who want to be part of Canada's success to fall by the wayside, because we're not investing in education or infrastructure that's going to allow them to be successful. So there's a lot of things we can do and we need to do that means, yes, we're facing a similar challenge to many developed countries around the world, but we have a set of solutions that those other countries simply cannot get their hands on.
Got another question. Which economies around the world could Canada take a lesson from?
Obviously, we think of the way Germany's been able to specialize both in environmental solutions and high-quality manufacturing as being a way to go. I was very pleased to see the kinds of connections we were building with Japan when I was there a few weeks ago for the G7. The conversations I had with big Japanese companies looking to expand and seeing a fit between what they were good at and what Canada could become good at, without falling into the challenges that Germany is facing on a number of fronts, but also Japan is facing on a growth front. I think there's a lot we can draw on from the world. And one of the great things about Canada is we are always happy and open to best practices around the world that I think often find themselves more easily adapted to the Canadian context than to other places where there is perhaps a little more rigidity than we have.
I don't see another app question, so I'm going to go back to the theme of trade for just a moment. What are you going to do? I know Canada very much wants the deal with Europe to go through. I do have an app question. So I'll take that, and then I'll come back to my earlier question.
Actually, but why don't I talk about CETA first for a bit? Okay. I haven't looked at the app questions. I don't know if it's one I want to avoid, but I'm hoping CETA really is important to me. And talking to the Economist here today, quite frankly, it's one that we've we inherited from our predecessors in a fairly precarious position where there were increasing concerns about the ISDS provisions, the dispute resolution processes within CETA, and we sat down and we went through that agreement and that particular section of it and got it to a place that Europe is, in some of the concerned voices within the German parliament and elsewhere, have now lined up very positively behind it. And we're extremely hopeful and positive about it being able to move forward now. The fact is, Europe is increasingly complex a jurisdiction to sign trade deals with. The tension between national governments and the European governments are mounting a little bit, and certainly we look at CETA as a bit of a test case. I mean, if Europe can't move forward on this, which is a very good deal for Europe, a very good deal for Canada, between very like-minded jurisdictions, then Europe, I think, is going to have some serious questions to ask itself. But we're being as helpful as we can as we push it forward, because trade, obviously, is extremely important to Canada and to the world. And making a strong case for trade and moving in that direction, despite the rise of protectionist sentiment and this closing in that will leave us all poorer in the long run, is something that I'm glad that Canada is a strong voice against.
So if Britain votes to leave the European Union, where's it going to be in the queue? Is it going to be at the head of the queue, or is it going to be at the back of the queue, as Barack Obama said it would be?
Well, CETA took about 7 years to negotiate. These are not done quickly or done easily. So there's a lot of work to do with any jurisdictions. But as I've said, I mean, no one, obviously, Brexit is a question for citizens of the UK to decide, but it'll take no great wisdom to realize that this Trudeau has fought for unity and bringing people together all my life, like my father did. And I think that division and breaking off is the wrong direction to go in this world. We're better with a strong UK within a strong Europe, and I'll say that loudly and clearly.
Here's the appropriate app question. An earlier speaker, Alan Gertner, said today that Canada can be to cannabis what France is to wine. Do you agree with that?
No, I absolutely disagree, because the caliber of Canadian wines now, from the Okanagan, from Niagara, means that, look, our approach on legalizing marijuana is not about creating a boutique industry or bringing in tax revenues. It's based on two very simple principles. The first one is young people have easier access to cannabis now in Canada than they do in just about any other countries in the world. 29 different countries studied by the UN, Canada was #1 in terms of underage access to marijuana. And whatever you might think, or studies seen about cannabis being less harmful than alcohol or even cigarettes, the fact is it is bad for the developing brain. And we need to make sure that it's harder for underage Canadians to access marijuana, and that will happen under a controlled and regulated regime. The other piece of it is there are billions upon billions of dollars flowing into the pockets of organized crime, street gangs, and gun runners because of the illicit marijuana trade. And if we can get that out of the criminal elements and into a more regulated fashion, we will reduce the amount of criminal activity that's profiting from those, and that has offshoots into so many other criminal activities. So those are my focuses on that. I have no doubt that Canadians and entrepreneurs will be tremendously innovative in finding ways to create positive economic benefits from the legalization and control of marijuana. But our focus is on protecting kids and protecting our streets.
Prime Minister, I fear I have to let you go. Thank you very, very, very much.